London, 1593. The city is dying. The plague has returned. Streets fall silent, doors are sealed, and death moves unseen through the air. The theatres, the very heart of London, are shut. Actors vanish. Playwrights disappear. For most, it is the end. But for William Shakespeare, it is the beginning. Cut off from the stage, he slips out of sight, into a world of ink and isolation. And there, in the shadow of a dying city, he begins to write something darker, stranger, more dangerous than anything he has done before. Not plays, but poems, filled with obsession, desire, and power. Words that don't just entertain, but expose something unsettling beneath the surface. Because this is where the mystery begins. How does a man with no university education, no noble birth, and almost no trace of a personal life come to understand kings, madness, love, and ambition better than anyone who has ever lived? In April 1564, in the modest market town of Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire, England, a child was born whose life would later transform the language of drama. Stratford was not a place where greatness was expected to emerge. It was a provincial town surrounded by open farmland and small villages, where the rhythms of life followed the predictable cycles of agriculture, trade, and church observance. Farmers arrived weekly to sell grain and livestock. Craftsmen worked in narrow timber-framed houses that doubled as workshops. The Avon River curved quietly through the landscape, linking the town to nearby markets while reinforcing its distance from the great political and cultural centres of the kingdom. In the mid-16th century, Stratford was prosperous enough to sustain a small but active community, yet limited in the opportunities it could offer its young people. Most lives were shaped by inheritance and trade, the future determined largely by the family into which one was born. William Shakespeare entered this world as the son of John Shakespeare and Mary Arden. His father, John, was a glover by trade, producing leather goods such as gloves and belts that were sold locally and at regional markets. Energetic and socially ambitious, John Shakespeare gradually expanded his activities beyond craftsmanship. He traded in wool, grain, and other commodities, building connections within Stratford's commercial life. Over time, his reputation allowed him to rise within the town's civic structure. He served in various municipal offices and eventually became an alderman, and later the town's bailiff, a position roughly equivalent to mayor. In a society where status depended heavily on visible participation in public life, these roles signaled both respectability and influence. For a period, the Shakespeare household stood among the more prominent families of Stratford. William's mother, Mary Arden, came from an older and more established rural background. The Arden family had deep roots in Warwickshire farming communities, their name associated with land and local tradition. Where John Shakespeare embodied social ambition and commercial enterprise. Within this household, the young William grew up surrounded by siblings in an environment that was both lively and demanding. Family life in Tudor England required constant work and cooperation. Children were expected to contribute early, learning discipline alongside practical skills needed for adult life. The texture of Shakespeare's childhood was shaped by the strong communal patterns that governed daily existence in Elizabethan England. Church attendance formed the centre of public and private life. Bells marked the hours of worship and the rhythm of the week, reminding townspeople of the religious authority that framed their world. Seasonal fairs brought bursts of activity to Stratford streets, filling the town with merchants, entertainers, and travellers who arrived with goods and stories from beyond Warwickshire. Markets bustled with voices bargaining over prices, while narrow lanes echoed with the sounds of craftsmen at work. For a perceptive child, the town offered a living theatre of human behaviour, gestures, quarrels, jokes, and ambitions unfolding in public view. It is widely believed that Shakespeare attended the Stratford Grammar School, an institution designed to educate the sons of respectable townsmen. Though records of his attendance have not survived, his father's civic position would have made such an education highly likely. The curriculum of a Tudor grammar school was demanding and steeped in classical learning. Students spent long hours mastering Latin grammar and studying the works of Roman authors whose writings formed the backbone of Renaissance education. Texts by Ovid introduced young readers to myths of transformation and desire. Seneca's Tragedies presented stories of revenge, ambition, and moral conflict. The comedies of Plautus displayed wit, disguise, and mistaken identity. Through repetition and translation exercises, students absorbed not only vocabulary but the dramatic structures and rhetorical rhythms of classical storytelling. Beyond the classroom, another form of performance occasionally appeared in Stratford. Travelling acting companies moved across England under the patronage of noble households, bringing theatrical entertainment to towns that lacked permanent stages. When such troupes arrived, they often performed in inn courtyards or municipal halls, transforming ordinary spaces into temporary theatres. Their productions combined music, comedy, and spectacle, captivating audiences who rarely encountered such elaborate storytelling. It is possible that young William witnessed these visiting players during his childhood, though the details remain uncertain. Yet the presence of these companies in provincial towns offered a glimpse of a broader cultural world, one in which stories could be enacted before an audience, voices carrying emotion and meaning through performance. While Shakespeare was still a boy, the fortunes of his family began to shift. By the late 1570s, John Shakespeare's prosperity showed signs of strain. His civic career faltered, and he gradually withdrew from public office. Financial pressures and possible legal difficulties clouded the stability that had once seemed secure. The exact causes of his decline remain unclear, but the change was visible enough to alter the atmosphere within the household. Where earlier years had promised upward mobility, uncertainty now crept into daily life. For William, moving through adolescence during this period, the experience may have offered an early lesson in the fragility of status. How quickly respectability could give way to anxiety in a society governed by reputation and credit. By the early 1580s, Shakespeare had entered adulthood in a town where expectations were well defined. Young men were expected to assume responsibility, whether through apprenticeship in a trade, work within the family business, or the formation of a household of their own. Opportunities beyond these paths were limited. London, the vibrant centre of England's cultural and political life, remained distant in both geography and imagination. Then, in 1582, an event occurred that shifted the course of Shakespeare's life. At 18 years old, he married Anne Hathaway, a woman from the nearby village of Shottery who was 8 years his senior. The marriage was arranged with unusual speed, requiring special permission to proceed quickly. Such haste suggests that circumstances made delay impractical, though the exact details remain obscured by time. For the young couple, the union carried both social responsibility and personal uncertainty. Marriage in Tudor England was not merely a romantic decision, but a practical arrangement shaped by family expectation and community oversight. At this moment in history, nothing in the record suggests that William Shakespeare would one day become the most celebrated playwright in the English language. He was simply a young husband in a provincial town, navigating the responsibilities of adulthood in a society that offered few paths beyond tradition. Yet somewhere within the ordinary landscape of Stratford, between the grammar school's Latin texts, the lively markets, and the fleeting spectacle of travelling actors, the imagination of William Shakespeare had begun quietly to stir. The marriage required a special license issued by the Bishop of Worcester, allowing the ceremony to proceed quickly and with fewer public announcements than was typical. Such licenses were not unheard of, but they often indicated a degree of haste that drew attention within small communities like Stratford-upon-Avon. The exact reasons for the urgency remain unclear, yet the timeline that followed offers an obvious explanation. In May 1583, just 6 months after the wedding, The couple's first child, Susanna, was baptized in the parish church of Holy Trinity. For Shakespeare, the arrival of a daughter so soon after marriage meant that the responsibilities of adulthood arrived swiftly. Stratford was a town where family life followed well-established patterns. A young husband was expected to support his household through steady work, often within a trade inherited or learned through apprenticeship. Yet the economic landscape surrounding Shakespeare was complicated. His father, John Shakespeare, whose early civic success had once placed the family among Stratford's respected citizens, had experienced financial decline during the previous decade. Business difficulties and legal troubles had gradually eroded the prosperity he once enjoyed. By the early 1580s, the Shakespeare household could no longer rely on the security it had known during William's childhood. 2 years later, in 1585, Anne Hathaway gave birth to twins, Hamlet and Judith. Their baptism, recorded again at Holy Trinity Church, marks one of the few surviving pieces of documentation from Shakespeare's early adulthood. With 3 young children now depending on him, the 21-year-old Shakespeare faced the pressures of providing for a growing family in a provincial town where economic opportunities remained limited. Stratford's economy depended largely on agriculture, small-scale trade, and local craftsmanship. Ambitious young men who sought broader prospects often looked beyond the town's narrow boundaries. It is at this point that Shakespeare's life enters one of the most mysterious chapters in literary history. From the birth of the twins in 1585 until the early 1590s, historical records reveal almost nothing about his whereabouts or activities. These 7 years have become known as Shakespeare's lost years, a period that has invited generations of historians and biographers to search for clues about how a young man from Warwickshire eventually emerged as a playwright in London's thriving theatrical world. Various possibilities have been proposed, though none can be confirmed with certainty. One suggestion is that Shakespeare worked as a schoolteacher. Grammar school education in Tudor England provided a strong foundation in Latin literature and rhetoric, and men who had received such training were sometimes employed to teach in smaller towns. Another theory proposes that he may have gained experience as a legal clerk. His later plays demonstrate an unusually detailed familiarity with legal terminology and courtroom procedures, knowledge that some scholars believe could have originated from practical work in a legal environment. Other historians have suggested that Shakespeare may have begun associating with travelling acting companies that toured the English countryside. These troupes, often sponsored by noble patrons, visited towns like Stratford to perform before local audiences. It is conceivable that Shakespeare encountered one of these groups and eventually joined their ranks, perhaps initially in a minor role, assisting with stage logistics or memorizing lines for small parts. The theatrical profession during this period was fluid and unpredictable, allowing individuals from varied backgrounds to enter its ranks. Among the most colourful stories connected to these lost years is the tale that Shakespeare fled Stratford after being accused of poaching deer on the estate of Sir Thomas Lucy, a local landowner. According to later accounts, the young Shakespeare angered Lucy by hunting illegally on his property and subsequently mocked the man in satirical verse. The story suggests that Shakespeare left the town to avoid legal consequences. While this anecdote has circulated widely in biographies and popular histories, its authenticity remains uncertain. It appears in sources written decades after the events it describes, and historians treat it cautiously. Nevertheless, its persistence reflects the fascination surrounding this undocumented period of Shakespeare's life. While the details of Shakespeare's movements remain unclear, the broader cultural context of England during these years offers important clues about the world he may have entered. The late 16th century witnessed a remarkable transformation in the theatrical life of London. Permanent playhouses had begun to appear just outside the city walls, where strict regulations against public entertainment were easier to circumvent. The theatre, built in 1576, and the nearby Curtain Theatre quickly became centres of popular entertainment. Crowds gathered to watch performances that combined poetry, music, comedy, and spectacle. Acting companies competed vigorously for audiences, staging both new plays and adaptations of familiar stories. London itself was expanding rapidly. Merchants, craftsmen, labourers and travellers poured into the city, creating a dynamic environment fueled by trade and ambition. The theatre thrived within this atmosphere. For audiences, it offered both amusement and reflection. Stories that echoed the political tensions, romantic intrigues, and moral dilemmas of the Elizabethan age. For aspiring writers and performers, it presented opportunities that simply did not exist in smaller towns like Stratford. It is within this vibrant theatrical culture that Shakespeare's path eventually becomes visible again. By the early 1590s, he had clearly established himself within London's dramatic community. The first surviving reference to him appears in 1592 in a pamphlet written by the playwright Robert Greene. In a scathing passage aimed at rivals within the theatre world, Greene warned his fellow writers about what he called an upstart crow, a man who, he claimed, had begun borrowing the work of more educated dramatists while pretending to match their skill. Though intended as an insult, Greene's remark reveals something important. Shakespeare had already become prominent enough to provoke jealousy among established writers. The phrase upstart crow suggests a newcomer rising rapidly within a profession dominated by university-educated playwrights who often viewed actors and provincial writers with suspicion. Shakespeare, whose background lay outside the universities, represented a new kind of literary figure, one who emerged not from academic institutions but from the practical world of theatre itself. By 1592, the young husband from Stratford had clearly transformed his circumstances. He was no longer simply a provincial father navigating family responsibilities in a small market town. Instead, he had entered the competitive and exhilarating world of London's theatres, where playwrights, actors, and entrepreneurs collaborated to create performances that captivated the city's diverse audiences. The details of how he travelled from Stratford to this stage remain uncertain. Yet the outcome is unmistakable. William Shakespeare had arrived in London, and his name was now circulating among the dramatists who defined the city's theatrical life. The quiet years of obscurity were ending. Ahead lay the extraordinary career that would soon reshape the possibilities of English drama. Shakespeare entered this world not simply as a writer but as a working member of the theatre community. Evidence suggests that he acted in some productions while simultaneously contributing scripts for performance. In doing so, he absorbed the practical realities of the stage. How dialogue must flow naturally between performers. How tension builds across a sequence of scenes. And how moments of comedy or spectacle can sustain audience engagement. His writing developed in constant dialogue with performance, shaped not by abstract literary ideals, but by the immediate reactions of live crowds. The earliest plays associated with Shakespeare reflect this environment of experimentation and collaboration. Historical dramas such as Henry VI explored the turbulent struggles for power that had defined England's medieval past. These plays presented battles, betrayals, and shifting loyalties with a vividness that resonated strongly with audiences fascinated by political intrigue. In Richard III, Shakespeare crafted a protagonist whose cunning ambition drove the story forward with magnetic force. Richard's ability to manipulate those around him revealed Shakespeare's growing skill in constructing characters who spoke directly to the audience's imagination. At the same time, Shakespeare explored comedy through works such as The Comedy of Errors. Drawing inspiration from classical sources he had likely encountered during his grammar school education, the play employed mistaken identities and rapid dialogue to produce an energetic farce. Even in these early works, the hallmarks of Shakespeare's dramatic style began to emerge. His characters spoke with a vitality that suggested distinct personalities, rather than mere narrative functions. His language moved fluidly between wit, poetry, and sharp emotional expression. Just as Shakespeare's career began gaining momentum, however, an unexpected crisis disrupted the theatrical world. In 1593, Outbreaks of plague swept through London with alarming intensity. Public gatherings were considered dangerous during such epidemics, and authorities ordered the closure of the city's playhouses to prevent further spread of disease. For actors and playwrights who depended on live performance for their livelihood, the shutdown created immediate uncertainty. Many writers sought alternative forms of expression during this period, and Shakespeare turned his attention to narrative poetry. In 1593, he published Venus and Adonis, a sensual retelling of a classical myth in which the goddess Venus pursues the reluctant young Adonis. The poem revealed a different aspect of Shakespeare's literary talent. Its language displayed a refined lyricism and emotional subtlety that contrasted with the vigorous action of his stage plays. The work quickly gained popularity, circulating widely among readers who admired its elegance and wit. A year later, Shakespeare published another narrative poem, The Rape of Lucrece. This darker story drew upon Roman legend to explore themes of honor, violence, and political upheaval. Like Venus and Adonis, the poem was dedicated to Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, a young nobleman known for his patronage of writers and artists. The dedication suggests that Shakespeare was cultivating connections within aristocratic circles, a development that could enhance both his reputation and his financial security. By 1594, the worst of the plague had subsided and London's theatres reopened. For Shakespeare, the resumption of performances marked a decisive turning point. He became closely associated with an acting company that would soon achieve remarkable prominence, the Lord Chamberlain's Men. Unlike many theatrical troupes that formed and dissolved with shifting fortunes, this company offered stability and organization. Its members functioned not only as performers, but also as shareholders in a business enterprise. Shakespeare himself became one of these shareholders, a position that gave him a direct financial stake in the company's success. The arrangement proved advantageous in multiple ways. It allowed Shakespeare to write consistently for a group of actors whose talents he knew well, shaping roles that suited their strengths. At the same time, the financial rewards from the company's performances provided a level of security unusual for playwrights of the era. Within the collaborative environment of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, Shakespeare's abilities flourished. His plays grew more confident in structure and richer in character, responding both to the tastes of audiences and the evolving ambitions of the company. Yet even as his professional life advanced rapidly, events in Stratford brought a quieter, more personal sorrow. In 1596, news arrived that Shakespeare's only son, Hamlet, had died at the age of 11. The boy's burial was recorded in the parish register of Holy Trinity Church, the same church where Shakespeare himself had been baptized 3 decades earlier. The loss of a child was tragically common in the 16th century, yet its emotional impact could not have been diminished by its familiarity. For Shakespeare, whose work increasingly explored themes of family, legacy, and mortality, the death of his son must have carried profound significance. The historical record offers little insight into how Shakespeare responded privately to this tragedy. His life in London continued, and his professional achievements advanced steadily. Yet the shadow of Hamlet's death lingers quietly within the chronology of his life, suggesting a grief that may have deepened the emotional resonance of his later works. Shakespeare's writing began to distinguish itself with increasing clarity. His plays did not simply recount stories. They explored the emotional contradictions of human life with unusual depth. During the late 1590s, he produced works that revealed an expanding range of imagination. In Romeo and Juliet, the familiar theme of youthful love unfolded within a tragic framework that emphasized both passion and inevitability. The language of the play moved with lyrical intensity, transforming the story of 2 young lovers into an enduring meditation on desire and fate. At roughly the same time, Shakespeare demonstrated a different dimension of his talent with A Midsummer Night's Dream. Here, the tone shifted toward playful fantasy, weaving together human romance, magical mischief, and theatrical humor. The play suggested that Shakespeare possessed not only the capacity for tragedy, but also a remarkable ability to capture the unpredictable joy and confusion of love. In The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare ventured into more complex moral territory. The play combined elements of comedy with moments of tension and ambiguity, particularly in the figure of Shylock, a character whose motivations and grievances challenged audiences to reconsider easy judgments. Such complexity reflected Shakespeare's growing confidence as a dramatist willing to explore uncomfortable questions about justice, prejudice, and mercy. Meanwhile, his historical plays, including the two parts of Henry IV, brought the turbulent politics of England's past vividly to life. These works did more than recount royal conflicts. They introduced characters who seemed to breathe with human contradiction. Among them was Sir John Falstaff, a figure whose wit, indulgence, and irrepressible vitality made him one of Shakespeare's most memorable creations. Through Falstaff, Shakespeare demonstrated an extraordinary gift for blending humor with insight, allowing audiences to recognize their own follies within the laughter of the theatre. As these plays captivated audiences, Shakespeare's professional environment underwent a transformation that would shape the rest of his career. In 1599, the members of the Lord Chamberlain's men undertook an ambitious project. Their previous playhouse, known as the Theatre, had become the subject of a dispute with its landlord. Rather than abandon the structure entirely, the company devised a bold solution. During the winter, they dismantled the building, carefully preserving its timber frame. These materials were then transported across the frozen Thames to a new location in Suffolk, where construction began on a larger and more impressive playhouse. The result was the Globe Theatre, a circular structure capable of holding several thousand spectators. Its open roof allowed performances to unfold in daylight, while its tiered galleries, an expansive yard, created an atmosphere of immediacy between actors and audience. The stage projected into the center of the space, placing performers in close proximity to the crowd that surrounded them on three sides. The Globe quickly became one of London's most celebrated theatrical venues. For Shakespeare, the Globe represented more than architectural achievement. It became the physical center of his creative world. Writing for this stage meant understanding its unique possibilities, the intimacy of its audience, the acoustics of its wooden structure, the ways in which actors could move and speak within its circular space. The theatre functioned as a laboratory where stories were tested before living audiences. Laughter, applause, and even silence became immediate feedback, shaping how scenes unfolded from one performance to the next. The actors of the Lord Chamberlain's men formed a close-knit ensemble whose talent Shakespeare understood intimately. Richard Burbage, the company's leading tragedian, possessed a commanding presence that made him ideal for complex roles. Shakespeare could write characters with the assurance that Burbage would bring them to life with emotional power. Such collaboration allowed playwright and performers to refine the art of dramatic storytelling in ways that extended beyond the written page. At the same time that Shakespeare's professional life flourished in London, his financial success allowed him to strengthen his connection with Stratford-upon-Avon. In 1597, he purchased New Place, one of the largest houses in the town. The acquisition signaled more than prosperity. It represented a kind of symbolic return. The boy who had grown up in a household shadowed by financial uncertainty now possessed one of Stratford's most impressive properties. Though Shakespeare spent much of his time in London, the purchase suggested that his identity remained anchored in the town where his life had begun. In 1603, the long reign of Queen Elizabeth I came to an end. Her death marked the close of an era that had shaped the cultural identity of England. The throne passed to James VI of Scotland, who became King James I of England. For Shakespeare and his fellow actors, this political transition brought an unexpected opportunity. The Lord Chamberlain's men received royal patronage under the new monarch, officially becoming the King's men. Yet this new stability coincided with a shift in the cultural atmosphere of the country. James I brought with him a different intellectual temperament than his predecessor. Where Elizabeth had presided over an era of outward confidence and expansion, James's reign unfolded in a climate more preoccupied with questions of authority, legitimacy, and the unseen forces that might influence human destiny. The king himself possessed a deep fascination with the supernatural, particularly with witchcraft and the moral dangers it represented. These themes filtered into the wider imagination of the time, shaping the theatrical environment in which Shakespeare now worked. It was during these early years of James's reign that Shakespeare's writing entered the most intense and psychologically ambitious phase of his career. The plays he composed between roughly 1603 and 1608 moved away from the lighter tonal balances of his earlier comedies and histories, exploring instead the darker terrain of human experience. Power, betrayal, jealousy, and moral uncertainty began to dominate his dramatic world. Characters who once might have resolved their conflicts through wit or reconciliation now faced dilemmas that seemed to cut to the core of human identity. Among these works, Hamlet stands as a profound meditation on grief and doubt. The play centers on a prince confronted with the death of his father and the unsettling revelation that the foundations of his world may rest upon betrayal. Yet the drama unfolds less as a story of revenge than as a study of hesitation and introspection. Hamlet's mind becomes a landscape of questions about morality, about justice, about the meaning of existence itself. His reflections move between philosophical inquiry and emotional turmoil, capturing a kind of intellectual paralysis that resonates far beyond the immediate circumstances of the plot. In presenting such a character, Shakespeare expanded the psychological possibilities of theatre, allowing audiences to witness the inner conflicts of a mind struggling to reconcile thought and action. The exploration of human vulnerability deepened further in Othello. Here the focus shifted toward the destructive power of jealousy and manipulation. Othello, a respected military commander, finds his confidence slowly eroded by insinuation and deceit. The tragedy unfolds not through external catastrophe, but through the subtle corrosion of trust. Shakespeare constructs a world in which words themselves become instruments of destruction. The manipulative figure of Iago demonstrates how easily doubt can be planted within a mind already vulnerable to insecurity. As the drama progresses, the boundaries between perception and reality blur, revealing how fragile human judgment can be when confronted with suspicion and fear. The emotional scale of Shakespeare's tragedies reached even greater heights with King Lear. In this work, the playwright turned his attention to the collapse of authority within both family and state. Lear, an aging monarch who seeks to divide his kingdom among his daughters, soon discovers that power without wisdom offers little protection against betrayal. As the drama unfolds, the king's descent into madness mirrors the unraveling of the social order around him. Storms rage across the stage, both literal and symbolic, reflecting the chaos that emerges when pride and blindness replace compassion. Through Lear's suffering, Shakespeare confronts the vulnerability of human dignity itself, presenting a vision of tragedy in which suffering strips away illusion and reveals the fragile core of existence. Around the same period, Shakespeare composed Macbeth, a play that reflects many of the anxieties surrounding the reign of King James. The drama unfolds in a world where ambition collides with supernatural temptation. Macbeth, a warrior celebrated for his loyalty, encounters prophetic witches whose predictions ignite a dangerous vision of power. The presence of these supernatural figures echoes James's own fascination with witchcraft and the unseen forces believed to shape human destiny. Yet the true drama of Macbeth lies not in the witches themselves, but in the psychological transformation of its central character. As Macbeth pursues the crown through violence and betrayal, he becomes haunted by guilt and paranoia. Shakespeare constructs a portrait of ambition that devours the very stability it seeks to create, leaving behind a mind consumed by fear. These tragedies, performed before both public audiences and royal spectators, revealed the extraordinary depth of Shakespeare's artistic ambition. The Globe Theatre remained the central stage upon which these works came to life. There, thousands of spectators gathered to witness dramas that pushed the boundaries of emotional intensity. The open-air theatre amplified the immediacy of performance. Actors stood within arm's reach of the crowd, delivering speeches that reverberated through the wooden structure and into the imagination of every listener present. The audience's reactions, gasps, murmurs, and moments of stunned silence became part of the living experience of the play. During these same years, the King's Men expanded their theatrical resources by gaining access to a second venue, the Blackfriars Theatre. Unlike the Globe, which was an outdoor playhouse open to large and varied crowds, Blackfriars was an indoor theatre illuminated by candlelight. Its smaller space created a more intimate atmosphere, attracting wealthier spectators who paid higher admission for a more refined theatrical experience. The enclosed environment allowed for subtler performances and more intricate stage effects. For Shakespeare, writing for Blackfriars introduced new possibilities in pacing and tone. Dialogue could become quieter, more reflective, and more nuanced, suited to an audience that listened with careful attention rather than the restless energy of the outdoor playhouse. As Shakespeare moved between these two theatrical worlds, his dramatic style continued to evolve. The emotional landscapes of his plays grew increasingly complex, exploring not only political intrigue but also the inner turmoil of individuals confronting their own limitations. The tragedies of this period do not offer easy moral resolutions. Instead, they present characters whose choices reveal the contradictions embedded within human nature itself. Ambition leads to ruin. Love becomes entangled with suspicion, and authority dissolves into vulnerability. By the year 1608, Shakespeare had reached what many later observers would regard as the summit of his creative achievements. The tragedies he had written during these years redefined the possibilities of drama, transforming the stage into a space where the deepest questions of human existence could be confronted openly. His characters spoke not merely to the audiences of Elizabethan and Jacobean England, but to generations yet to come, embodying dilemmas that seemed universal and timeless. Yet even as Shakespeare explored the darkest corners of the human mind, his imagination was beginning to shift once again. Having examined the collapse of kingdoms, the corruption of ambition, and the fragility of identity, he would soon turn toward stories shaped by reconciliation and renewal. The tragedies had pushed his art to extraordinary intensity. What followed would reveal another dimension of the playwright's vision, one that sought not only to confront suffering but to imagine the possibility of forgiveness beyond it. It was during this period that Shakespeare's dramatic voice began to evolve toward what later critics would describe as the late romances. These plays do not belong neatly to the familiar categories of tragedy or comedy. Instead, they combine elements of both, weaving together moments of darkness and loss with the unexpected emergence of reconciliation. The emotional landscape they inhabit is one in which suffering is not erased but transformed, and where time itself becomes a force capable of healing what once seemed permanently broken. One of the earliest works associated with this new phase is Pericles, a story shaped by storms, shipwrecks, and long separations. The play unfolds across distant lands and shifting fortunes, following characters who endure hardship before being reunited through improbable circumstances. While traces of tragedy remain present, the emotional direction of the story moves steadily toward recovery. The tone suggests that suffering may serve as a passage rather than an ending, opening the possibility of renewal after loss. Shakespeare continued to explore this evolving dramatic vision in Cymbeline, a work that blends political intrigue with romance and adventure. In this play, misunderstandings and betrayal threaten to destroy relationships, yet the narrative ultimately moves toward reconciliation. The boundaries between enemies and allies become fluid, and the resolution emerges through recognition and forgiveness rather than revenge. Such storytelling marked a departure from the bleak finality of tragedies like King Lear or Macbeth. Shakespeare's imagination now seemed increasingly drawn toward the idea that even profound suffering might lead, in time, to restoration. Perhaps the most striking example of this transformation appears in The Winter's Tale. The play begins with jealousy and suspicion powerful enough to shatter a family and destroy a kingdom's sense of order. Yet instead of ending in irreversible catastrophe, the story unfolds across years of separation before gradually moving toward reunion. Time becomes an almost mystical presence within the play, allowing wounds to heal and relationships to be rebuilt. The emotional journey of The Winter's Tale captures something distinctive about Shakespeare's later work. The recognition that human error may cause devastation, yet forgiveness remains possible even after deep loss. This evolving vision reached its most elegant expression in The Tempest. Set upon a remote island where the exiled Duke Prospero commands the elements through magic, the play unfolds like a meditation on power, responsibility, and release. Prospero orchestrates a series of encounters that bring his former enemies within reach of his authority. Yet instead of seeking revenge, he ultimately chooses reconciliation. The resolution of the play rests not on triumph but on forgiveness. Prospero's final renunciation of his magical powers, his decision to break his staff and drown his books, has often been interpreted as symbolic of Shakespeare himself stepping away from the theatrical world that had defined his life. While Shakespeare continued to write for the London stage, his connection to Stratford-upon-Avon grew stronger during these years. His house at New Place had already established him as one of the town's most prominent residents. Increasingly, he divided his time between the bustling theatrical environment of London and the quieter rhythms of his hometown. Stratford offered a different kind of life from the crowded streets near the Globe Theatre. Here, Shakespeare could spend time among family, overseeing his property and participating in the social fabric of the town where his story had begun decades earlier. This gradual shift did not mean that Shakespeare had abandoned the theatre entirely. The King's Men remained one of the most successful companies in England, and his plays continued to attract enthusiastic audiences. Yet the pace of his involvement in London began to slow. Younger playwrights were emerging, and Shakespeare increasingly collaborated with others on certain projects, suggesting that his role within the theatrical world was evolving. In 1613, an event occurred that symbolized the fragile nature of the theatrical world Shakespeare had helped shape. During a performance of Henry VIII at the Globe Theatre, a stage cannon was fired as part of the dramatic spectacle. The spark from the cannon ignited the thatched roof above the stage. Within minutes, flames spread across the structure, consuming the wooden beams that had once echoed with the voices of actors and the applause of thousands of spectators. The fire destroyed the theatre completely. Remarkably, no lives were lost in the disaster, and plans were quickly made to rebuild the Globe. Yet the incident carried a powerful symbolic weight. The theatre that had served as the primary stage for Shakespeare's greatest works, where Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear had once unfolded before captivated audiences, had vanished in a matter of hours. Although a new Globe would soon rise in its place, the destruction of the original building seemed to mark the passing of a particular chapter in the history of English drama. By this point, Shakespeare's own relationship with the London stage was already beginning to loosen. His later plays suggested a mind increasingly interested in themes of reconciliation rather than conflict, reflection rather than ambition. The emotional violence that dominated his earlier tragedies gave way to stories in which forgiveness offered the possibility of healing. Around 1613, Shakespeare's presence in London became less frequent as he spent more time in Stratford. The playwright, who had once written relentlessly for the crowded theatres along the Thames, was gradually withdrawing from the world that had made him famous. Yet he left behind something extraordinary. Over the course of 2 decades, he had transformed the possibilities of the stage, creating characters and stories that captured the complexity of human life with unmatched depth. As Shakespeare stepped quietly away from the centre of theatrical life, the plays he had written continued to resonate within the imagination of audiences. The storm of his creative energy had reshaped English drama, But now that storm was beginning to calm. The final chapter of his life would unfold not on the stages of London, but in the quieter surroundings of the town where his journey had first begun. His home, New Place, stood as one of the largest residences in Stratford. Purchased years earlier during the height of his success in London, it now became the centre of his domestic life. The house and its gardens represented a kind of stability that Shakespeare's earlier years could never have promised. As a young man, he had left Stratford in uncertain circumstances, seeking opportunity in the theatrical world. Now he returned not as an obscure provincial, but as a prosperous landowner whose reputation extended far beyond the town's borders. Despite his growing distance from London, Shakespeare did not entirely sever his connection to the stage. His company, the King's Men, remained one of the most prominent theatrical groups in England. Their performances continued at court and in the playhouses of the city, and Shakespeare still maintained ties with the actors and writers who carried forward the work of the company. Yet the nature of his involvement had changed. The intense creative output that had once produced play after play began to slow, and collaboration with younger dramatists became more common. One of these younger writers was John Fletcher, a playwright who would eventually become one of the leading figures of the Jacobean stage. Shakespeare and Fletcher worked together on several plays during these final years, including Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen. These collaborations suggest a transition not only in Shakespeare's own career, but also in the theatrical world more broadly. A new generation of dramatists was emerging, and Shakespeare appeared willing to share the stage with them, gradually allowing the future of English drama to pass into different hands. Meanwhile, Shakespeare's personal life in Stratford continued to unfold around family and community. His eldest daughter, Susanna, lived nearby with her husband, John Hall, a physician whose education and professional reputation placed the family among the town's respected households. Their daughter Elizabeth, Shakespeare's granddaughter, represented the continuation of the family line. Through visits and daily interaction, Shakespeare now experienced a role that had rarely been visible during his years in London, that of a grandfather watching the next generation grow. His younger daughter, Judith, remained unmarried for many years, before eventually marrying Thomas Quiney in early 1616. The marriage brought with it a brief period of legal complications that unsettled the family's otherwise stable domestic life. Quiney soon became entangled in a scandal involving another woman, leading to ecclesiastical court proceedings and public scrutiny. Though the episode was handled within the structures of the time, it introduced an element of tension into Shakespeare's final months, and likely influenced the careful arrangements he would soon make regarding his estate. In March of 1616, Shakespeare drafted his last will and testament. The document reveals a man attentive to the distribution of property and mindful of the responsibilities that came with his accumulated wealth. Most of his estate was left to Susanna and her descendants, a decision that reflected the legal conventions of inheritance in the period. The will also included provisions for friends and colleagues, including fellow actors from the King's Men, indicating that the bonds formed during his theatrical career remained important to him. Among the details of the will, one particular line has attracted centuries of attention. Shakespeare bequeathed his second-best bed to his wife, Anne Hathaway. To later readers, the phrase has often appeared puzzling or even dismissive, but its meaning remains uncertain. In the domestic customs of the time, the best bed was often reserved for guests, while the second-best bed served as the marital bed of the household. Historians continue to debate the significance of this bequest, and the surviving document offers no explanation beyond the brief notation itself. By the spring of 1616, Shakespeare's life had become firmly rooted in Stratford. The years of theatrical competition and creative intensity that had defined his career were now behind him. The town that had once seemed too small for his ambitions had become the place where he spent the final chapter of his life. In April of that year, Shakespeare fell ill. The precise nature of his illness remains unknown, and contemporary records provide only limited details. What is clear is that his condition worsened quickly. On April the 23rd, 1616, at the age of 52, William Shakespeare died in the same town where he had been born more than half a century earlier. His burial took place at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, the parish church that had marked important moments throughout his life. It was here that he had been baptized as an infant, and now the church became his final resting place. His grave was placed within the chancel of the building, a position that reflected both his status and the respect he commanded within the community. Carved into the stone above his burial site was an epitaph that has intrigued visitors for centuries. The inscription warns anyone who might disturb the grave against moving his bones, invoking both blessing and curse in language characteristic of the period's beliefs about burial and spiritual rest. Such warnings were not unusual in early modern England, where the relocation of remains sometimes occurred during renovations or expansions of church buildings. Shakespeare's epitaph expresses a simple desire for permanence, that the place of his burial remain undisturbed. At the time of his death, Shakespeare was known as a successful playwright, actor, and businessman whose works had entertained audiences across London and beyond. Yet the full magnitude of his achievement had not yet come into focus. His plays continued to be performed by the King's men, circulating through the theatrical world much as they had during his lifetime. They remained part of the living repertory of the stage, appreciated by audiences who recognized their power but could not yet see the vast legacy that would follow. The man who had once arrived in London as an unknown provincial had quietly returned to Stratford at the end of his life, leaving behind a body of work that would gradually travel far beyond the theatres where it first appeared. As Shakespeare's life came to a close in the spring of 1616, the plays he had written began a journey that would extend across centuries and cultures. The playwright himself had stepped away from the stage, but the words he created were only beginning their long life in the world. Within a few years of Shakespeare's death, two of his closest colleagues recognized the importance of preserving what he had created. John Heminges and Henry Condell, both longtime actors in The King's Men, had worked beside Shakespeare for many years. They had spoken his lines on stage and witnessed the response of audiences who gathered to watch his stories performed. Perhaps more than anyone else, they understood the scope of his achievement. Determined that his work should not disappear with time, they began the laborious process of collecting the plays he had written. The project required patience and dedication. Scripts had to be gathered from different sources. Prompt books used in the theatre, manuscripts preserved by actors, and previously printed versions that often contained errors or omissions. Piece by piece, Heminges and Condell assembled a collection that would bring together a large portion of Shakespeare's dramatic work in a single volume. Their efforts culminated in 1623 with the publication of a monumental book, now known as the First Folio. Printed 7 years after Shakespeare's death, the volume presented 36 plays carefully organized into 3 broad categories: comedies, histories, and tragedies. Among the works preserved within its pages were dramas that might otherwise have disappeared entirely, including Macbeth, Julius Caesar, The Tempest, Twelfth Night, and Measure for Measure. Without the First Folio, much of Shakespeare's most celebrated writing could have been lost to history. Within the pages of the First Folio appeared tributes from fellow writers who had known Shakespeare during his lifetime. Among these was a poem by the playwright Ben Jonson, one of the most prominent literary figures of the era. Jonson's words captured the growing sense that Shakespeare's achievement reached beyond the boundaries of ordinary theatrical success. In praising his former colleague, Jonson famously wrote that Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time. The phrase suggested that the plays contained something universal, an insight into human experience that would remain meaningful long after the circumstances of their creation had faded. In the decades following the publication of the First Folio, Shakespeare's reputation gradually expanded. His plays continued to be performed on English stages, though often in adapted forms that reflected changing tastes. The political upheavals of the mid-17th century temporarily closed the theatres of England, but when public performances resumed after the Restoration in 1660, Shakespeare's works returned with renewed prominence. Actors discovered in his characters a range of emotional and dramatic possibilities unmatched by most other playwrights. Audiences encountered stories that blended humour with tragedy, poetry with raw human conflict. By the 18th century, scholars and critics began examining Shakespeare's plays with increasing seriousness. Editors worked to produce new printed editions that clarified the language and restored passages that earlier publications had omitted. The playwright who had once written for the noisy playhouses of London was now studied as a literary figure whose work deserved careful interpretation. Readers discovered within his dramas a remarkable capacity to capture the contradictions of human nature, ambition and compassion, love and jealousy, courage and doubt. Over time, the influence of Shakespeare's writing extended far beyond the borders of England. His plays were translated into other languages and performed in theatres across Europe. Actors and directors experimented with new interpretations of familiar stories, discovering that characters such as Hamlet, Lady Macbeth, and King Lear spoke to audiences from vastly different cultures and historical periods. The emotional conflicts embedded within the plays proved remarkably adaptable, allowing each generation to find its own reflections within Shakespeare's words. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Shakespeare's legacy lies in the language itself. Phrases drawn from his plays gradually entered everyday speech, shaping the rhythm and vocabulary of English expression. His characters became symbols of enduring human experiences. The tragic hesitation of Hamlet, the consuming ambition of Macbeth, the youthful passion of Romeo and Juliet. These figures moved beyond the confines of the stage to become part of a shared cultural imagination. Yet even as Shakespeare's influence spread across centuries and continents, the details of his own life remained surprisingly elusive. Compared with the immense body of writing he left behind, the surviving documents that record his personal history are few. Contracts, property records, and legal papers provide glimpses of the man who lived in Stratford and worked in London. But they reveal little about the inner world from which his characters emerged. In this sense, Shakespeare remains partly mysterious, a writer whose imagination seems far more visible than the life that produced it. From the modest streets of Stratford-upon-Avon to the crowded playhouses of London, Shakespeare's journey unfolded within the cultural landscape of Elizabethan and Jacobean England. The boy who grew up among market stalls and grammar school lessons became a playwright whose stories reached audiences from every level of society. Through the power of language and dramatic insight, he transformed familiar themes of love, ambition, betrayal, and forgiveness into works that continue to resonate long after the world that shaped them has vanished. The man himself was buried quietly beneath the stone floor of Holy Trinity Church, his life ending in the same town where it began. Yet the voices he created, kings and jesters, lovers and rebels, did not fall silent with him. They continued to speak across generations, carried forward by actors, readers, and audiences who discovered within them reflections of their own hopes and fears. Shakespeare's life came to an end in the spring of 1616, but the stories he left behind began a far longer journey, one that continues to unfold wherever the words of his plays are heard.